Good morning. Welcome to our second session this morning. Today we have the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association providing a presentation for us. We have Tyler Kellar. He is Health and Safety Representative here in Thunder Bay, a consultant, and Margaret Cernigoj, also from Thunder Bay. Are you from Thunder Bay as well? Okay, both from the Thunder Bay area providing consultant services, I guess, to all things safety. Anyways, here they are. So I have to assume the position up here. Okay.
Yeah, just I guess a little background information on, I'll do myself and Margaret will introduce herself. So I'm Tyler Kellar. I'm the local area consultant with the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association. Born and raised in Thunder Bay. I've been doing this for about 3 years now. In my previous life, I was a construction laborer with Laguna for 20 years or so. So spent a lot of time in the field, worked in various sectors, low-rise, large ICI projects on the roads, highways, residential. So cement finisher by trade, but got to learn a lot of specialized labor type stuff over the years. So.
And as you know, my name is Margaret Cernigoj. I'm with Workplace Safety Prevention Services. I'm also born and raised in Thunder Bay, but I've had the privilege of working across Canada, a lot of it in the health and safety space. Our organization works with the industrial sector. So we work with manufacturing, we work with retail, we work with offices and service types of industries.
Yeah.
So that's us.
Yeah, my sector would be more of the transportation, electrical utility, and construction side of things. So. We're Ontario Safe Work Association, so we're basically the prevention arm of the Ministry of Labour. The bulk of our time is spent doing training, I would say. We do a lot of consulting, job site audits, just generally help anybody with anything health and safety. So please use us as a resource. We'll give you all our information at the end here. We thought we'd talk today a little bit about orientation and the value of a good orientation in your workplace, in your community. An effective health and safety orientation can help prevent injuries and illnesses. A lot of us do very high-risk work, certainly living in remote areas and stuff like that. So important that all the workplace parties understand their duties and responsibilities under the Act and such. And that can be done through a great orientation at the beginning of whatever you're doing. We say an investment in your future, certainly. So a lot of people say health and safety costs a lot of money, but we've actually proven that it does balance itself out in the end. The cost of training or buying some specialized equipment will be a lot cheaper if you end up having an injury or heaven forbid a fatality or something like that.
So in terms of why should you have a health and safety orientation, or why should you do health and safety training? Well, basically, it's the right thing to do. It does a lot of things. It keeps your community safe. And really, are there any parents in the room? Yeah, there's a couple of parents in the room. So the question for you would be, who's keeping your children safe when they're out working, right? That's why health and safety orientations become so valuable, because we want to keep, again, our community safe. We definitely want our kids coming home at the end of their workday as well.
So what does the Act say about health and safety? First, the employer, of course, is the ultimately responsible for everybody's health and safety in your workplace. Section 25(2)(a) of the Act says an employer's got to provide workers and supervisors with any information, instruction, and supervision, pardon me, to a worker to protect the worker's health and safety. And we also have this 25(2)(h), which I call it a catch-all clause in the legislation that says we have to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. I've often seen a company get charged with multiple offenses and they'll tack that on at the end, or we'll see if they don't know exactly what to charge you with, they'll charge you with something like take everything, what's reasonable is the question, right? So very important to understand everybody's duties under the Act and the workplace parties. So just know that this should start at the employer. So we'd like to see the employer developing and giving very good orientation to workers. There's all sorts of ways this can be done, and I'll let Margaret mention a little bit about Canada Labour Code, which would be a federal piece of legislation. So a lot of things that cross borders, transportation firms, telecommunications, stuff like that.
So as most of you know, on reserve, you are governed by federal legislation. So chief and council, the band, everything pertains to the Canada Labour Code Part 2. Now it becomes a little tricky sometimes on reserves because some of the activities that we're doing are covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So that's why we put both pieces of legislation up here, because both can apply to you. So under federal legislation, an employer, as you can see, has a duty to ensure the health and safety of every person employed, and they need to make sure the health and safety of everyone is protected. And likewise, the employer has to provide training, has to ensure that every worker knows about the hazards involved in their work, thereby keeping themselves safe. So the legislation's the same, or essentially the same, whether it's Ontario legislation or federal legislation. The difficult thing sometimes is on the reserve, you need to know both pieces of legislation. And as you know, any piece of legislation is so much fun to read because it's really written in very straightforward English. But still information you need to know, and so we can help you learn about the legislation. You know, both Tyler and I, we do a lot of training around legislation, the requirements, and what you need to know, as well as the federal legislation.
Yeah, most of our programs and most of the training we do is all built around the intent of the legislation, so to speak.
So we wanted to talk a bit about due diligence, because some of that wording in the legislation says, as an employer, whether it's the band as the employer or you're a department or a business owner on the reserve, you have an obligation to protect the health and safety of your worker, and you need to show your due diligence. So when we talk about due diligence, do you understand what we're talking about? Everyone? So due diligence means you're walking the talk, and you can demonstrate it. So should you be involved with the Ministry of Labor inspector, they might give you orders, or if they come on site to do an inspection, they're going to want to see you and have you demonstrate your due diligence. Similarly, when a health and safety officer from the federal government comes on board, comes onto the reserve, they may also want to see what you're doing around health and safety, and you need to demonstrate your due diligence. And one of the key things to know is due diligence is your only defense if they're coming on board, or should something unfortunate happen, you need to be able to demonstrate your due diligence. And the most important thing around due diligence is, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So if you say, hey, we put Tyler through the orientation program, but you don't have it documented, doesn't exist, it didn't happen. So it's important to know your role as an employer around due diligence, because it's the only thing that's going to save you should you end up in the courts or in a fine situation or getting orders or anything like that.
Yeah. I think I always say the simplest way to explain due diligence is taking care, right? A lot of firms out there are compliant, but a lot of them care. A lot of them go above and beyond. So, in the construction world, certainly recording your activity has become a huge part of that. Stuff like your logbook, if you're a supervisor, a worker should be keeping logbooks. The actions you took or didn't take will come into play as far as due diligence goes. So doing stuff such as your orientation and your job site inspections and job hazard analysis and stuff like that are all great pieces of due diligence. So what's in it for you? Well, knowledge, definitely knowledge. The more aware we become about hazards and the more we understand our work, and there's a lot of changes happening with this stuff where we don't look at work the same old way we used to, and we have to start changing the way we do things. And it is certainly an investment in your workforce or in your community. There's certainly monetary gain and value in it. The cost of a worker having a lost time injury or getting hurt or a fatality is astronomical. So sometimes people think, oh, I have to go out and spend $5,000 on all this specialized equipment, but that is a very low cost if a worker is ever hurt. Culture, I like the word culture there, and that's kind of where we are in the health and safety world now. There's a big cultural shift happening, and You know, I can think about orientations that I had 20 years ago, and you laugh today about it, and probably 20 years from now, we'll laugh at the things we talk about now. It's become very hard to operate for a lot of people. It's very hard to keep up with a lot of this stuff. There's no more welcome to the job, here's a WMIS test and the answer sheet type of thing, and fill in the blanks. And now in my world of construction, we want to see a very thorough orientation, explaining to your workers and supervisors their duties, their responsibilities, the scope of the work, certainly the hazards, sharing the knowledge of the hazards. We want to see workers taken right out on site, and you know, these hazards should be pointed out to them. And of course, all this is the law. You have a legal requirement to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of your workers and supervisors and communities and so on and so forth.
One of the other things is we talk about teamwork, right? So if you're doing a health and safety orientation, you're creating the team, right? Everyone knows how to work safely. You're supporting your coworkers. You've got someone's back. It goes to, as Tyler was saying, building that safety culture. And if you can do it right from the outset when you bring a new worker on site, that's the place to start, and that's where we find it's most effective.
Absolutely.
So who needs to be oriented? What do you think? All the employees. Andre's our star. Anyone else? All the administration. Excellent. Anyone else? So, pardon me? So you nailed it. Like, you know, all workers, you know, even managers and supervisors, they need to be oriented. They need to have the training. You know, so we talk about, you know, new workers, we talk about students. How many people bring students on during the summer months? Yeah, do you go through an orientation with them? Excellent, excellent, perfect. What about people that are promoted or transferred? Do they have to go through a health and safety orientation? They should. Does it always happen that way?
No.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And, you know, what about people returning back from an injury? Do you think they need to go through an orientation? Yeah, they should. Something might have changed, right? And sometimes when you get an injury, it doesn't mean you're coming back to work the next day. Sometimes it could be several months down the road if it's really a serious injury. So yeah, those returning workers, we want to make sure they go through the orientation again as well. And what about contract workers? You know, again, they're coming onto your work site, even if it's a short period of time, we want to make sure they have a health and safety orientation. It's your duty as an employer. And we also talk about, you know, supply of labor. Just, you know, you need someone for one day. They still need to know how to work safely on your site. And then I also put up here seasoned employees. So by seasoned, I mean those really experienced employees. Why do you think they need a health and safety orientation? Anyone? Complacent, or they know it all, right? Yeah.
So who does your orientation? Anyone here doing orientations?
We have our department head do that.
Sure.
Excellent.
You know, to me, it's anybody who's competent to do the orientation in my eyes. Supervisors, certainly. Supervisor is probably the most scrutinized workplace party. The role as a supervisor, they bear the weight of the world out there, and it's a fact. So I think the province has recognized a lack of competent supervision out there, and it's not in to do your work, it's in the health and safety side of things. Your coworker, so you step into a new position. I worked with tradespeople my whole life, so we learned side by side in the trenches kind of a thing. So employers certainly should be orientating everybody below them. Health and safety rep, there's a kind of a new growing position in construction. As soon as you have 5 or more workers on a construction project, you have to have a worker rep in place. Now the legislation says they actually have to sit through training to be able to effectively do their job. And they're the voice of the worker, basically. Quite often, I was a health and safety rep for many years, job steward on the job, so I was responsible for doing stuff like site orientations for new workers. Your joint health and safety committee or your worker trades committees, stuff like that. We have this thing called the internal responsibility system. It's kind of embedded into the legislation. And the ministry basically expects a few things from us. They want to see us to become self-reliant in our workplaces, right? So the more we understand how to read this stuff and to communicate it to others, that self-reliance, to take care of our own problems on site. You can't phone them every day. They're going to come eventually probably say, you're going to need to get some training and such. They want to see us use best practices, so things that aren't necessarily legislated, but they're accepted, safe ways of doing things across the industry, and to continually improve. I see lots of firms, I can go in and ask usually about 4 or 5 questions. You can see if their IRS is on the rise or on the fall. Some companies takes months, some companies take years, some may never get there. So, and the idea of that IRS is, who would be in the best position in your workplace to recognize hazards and do something about it? Well, it's people like us, the workers and the supervisors in the field. And I always say the IRS is this: it's labor and management working together to resolve any health and safety issues in your workplace. And you put that back to orientation. So if all this is laid out on the table on day 1 of your work, it sure makes things smoother in the workplace, I would say.
Under the federal legislation, you need to have a workplace health and safety committee, right? Under the Ontario legislation, it's a joint health and safety committee. Under the federal legislation, it's a workplace health and safety committee. Often they don't do the orientation, but they play a really important role in reviewing your orientation program to make sure it's supporting the internal responsibility system. So we talked about it being a competent person. So the person who's doing your orientation or your training should be a competent person, okay? And a competent person means someone who's qualified because of knowledge, training, and experience to organize the work and its performance. So by knowledge, we mean knowledge about health and safety, training meaning they've been trained in health and safety, and they have some experience on the work site around how to work safely, okay? And when we talk about performance, we're talking about health and safety performance. We're not talking about, hey man, we cut down 10 trees, in 1 minute. Not that kind of performance or profit performance. This is all health and safety performance, okay? And you need to have someone who's familiar with the legislation, right? Both the provincial legislation and the Canada Labor Code as well. So you need to know what the rules are if you're going to be training someone in health and safety or doing a health and safety orientation. And here's the real kicker: you need to have knowledge of the potential or actual hazards associated with the job. So sometimes you could have a supervisor. I could be a supervisor of an operation, and I can organize the work. I can tell Tyler what he needs to do, and I can tell you what you need to do and what you need to do. But I might not actually know how to do the work. I might not know how to operate that forklift. I'm just organizing the work. So in that case, I'm not competent because I'm just the organizer. If you've got that competent person there, they know about the actual work. So you don't want someone like me training you to drive a forklift because I don't have that skill and I don't know about the hazards. Well, actually, I know about some of the hazards. Tyler?
Yeah, and when the ministry comes into your workplace, and that's what they kind of do now. You're going to be judged on your competency or challenged on your competency. If you are working on a roof, working at heights, wearing harnesses with ropes and all that, they're going to start asking, what's the difference between fall arrest and travel restraint, or what type of system are you working in? What type of pre-job planning have you done? So what they're doing there is trying to challenge your competence. I'm not sure anyone ever becomes fully competent. I think we're always striving to become more competent as far as the definition goes. And like I mentioned, there was a lack of competent supervision in the province, and it's in that second point. Because I could do a supervisor course for 20 construction workers, and I'll say, how many of you guys know how to read the green book? Guys, girls? If one person in the room put up their hand, we're doing pretty good. But yet, for us to be competent person and competent worker, and the only definition difference between competent person and competent worker is either organize the work or perform the work. So even workers are held to this standard of competence as well, right? A big one where I see is workers, they have a legal duty to report any hazards on the site. So if you start out in your orientation program and say, hey, this is what we do, we want to see all the hazards reported to the supervisors, and you promote that kind of culture, that's going to definitely improve your the health and safety overall in your workplace, your performance and such.
So just about competence, or a competent person, and maybe that incompetent trainer, that's the person who says, just go and Google it, right? That means they absolutely don't know, right? Or they do the entire orientation in 3 minutes. Everything you needed to know about your job, the health and safety stuff, in 3 minutes, right? Clearly, they're not competent. So that's kind of, we need to be aware of those kinds of things when we talk about the competent person.
Yeah, in construction, they used to show up on the first day and they'd hand you this little tiny booklet and they'd say, okay, read this book, take it home and sign it. And you're basically, what you were signing is, yeah, I understand your company's policies and programs and such, but did you ever understand any of it? Probably not. Problem being is, is that information trickling down to the workers, and are they being trained and orientated properly on the information? So it's a huge part of it.
So we already answered this. Is the supervisor always the best person to be doing the orientation? Maybe not. Not if they're just organizing the work, but they don't actually know how to do the work.
And it's tough to be a supervisor. They usually get the worst orientation. One day you're a worker, and all of a sudden you show up tomorrow, now you're in charge. So, they didn't go to supervisor school overnight. Sometimes it's hard to let the other part of your work go, because now you have charge over workers in a workplace and such. And a lot of duty, a lot of responsibility, again, on that supervisor. Two groups of workers, new and young workers. So certainly we're seeing large amounts of young workers, vulnerable workers in the industry across all sectors, I would say. We have an aging population. I think construction, we're going to lose 25 to 50% of our workforce in the next 10 years. That has never historically happened, so we're preparing for that. A great time to get into the trades, into construction and stuff like that, because there's a lot of opportunity. I often tell some of my young guys, you will be running a $10 million job 5 years from now, and they look at you funny, and there you see him down the road, and there he is, the supervisor on this big project, right? So, vulnerable worker is a term we talk about a lot, so it fit between 15 and 24-ish. I think I read somewhere you have a 1 in 13 shot of getting hurt on your first job in the first little bit of time. In construction, that's about 1 in 5. In construction, usually accidents are bad. You've usually probably lost a piece of your body, or you've been critically injured. Very high risk work, right? So, other vulnerable workers I see would be people coming from other industries. So forestry gets slow, or the mill closes down. A lot of these people come to other industries. So a lot of them are very well versed in health and safety, but it's just the hazards in my industry and construction are a lot different. If you worked at the mill, the hazards probably don't change very often unless you got a new piece of equipment or a new process. Well, construction, there may be a wall here tomorrow. So all of our hazards change day to day, second to second, minute to minute, very quickly. Seasoned workers, well, we talked a little bit about that. There's that angle of complacency out there, and a lot of our work is very repetitious. So it only takes a very short lapse in judgment or one mistake. We do make mistakes. We are all human, and hopefully you don't pay the ultimate price, but it certainly has happened out there. And yeah.
Just the other group of vulnerable workers are people who've been removed from the workplace for a long time. Often we used to talk about women going back into, raising their children and then coming back into the workforce. Sometimes they're vulnerable because they haven't been exposed to health and safety. And, if they're going into construction, you want to have some training to go into that. As well, people with English as a second language, going into work as well, they might have some difficulties. They're vulnerable, again, because they may not be understanding everything. So orientation becomes critically important for them. So when we talk about new and young workers, I just wanted to...
Oh, sorry, Grace,
I'm
question?
sorry.
I was going to ask you, what is, you're going to talk about, I was going to say, what's the most common accident? Is it like falls or...
Depending on the
someone
sector,
being
in
buried?
construction, the number one traumatic killer is falls. Has been for a long
My
time.
son does not hesitate to walk around the top plate of a wall and crawl around the trusses, and he's not tied.
Yeah, it's tough. Certain scopes of work are very hard, and that's where I'm talking about the culture's changing, the challenges of our work are changing. So we have to start, sometimes you have to build a better mousetrap type of deal. So that's where industry's at in a lot of sense. In construction, the number one overall killer is still occupational disease. And most of that, you can probably relate about 90% of that to asbestos exposure, silica exposure, stuff like that. So,
Some of the other more common injuries or types of injuries are slips, trips, and falls. Okay? It applies in construction, I mean, good housekeeping on a construction site, but it applies to almost every work site, right? Slips, trips, and falls. We're in the middle of winter now, you know? We see a lot of slips, trips, and falls. The other one is contact with equipment. Okay, so either being hit by equipment, bumping into equipment, things like that. Motor vehicle incidents is the other big one. You know, right now, just this morning, how many motor vehicles, some very significant, serious motor vehicle accidents happening, you know, in our winter weather.
Yeah, sometimes getting to work's the biggest hazard one.
Yeah.
Most people here know that, you live remotely, and a lot of you drove a long way to get here, so a lot of hazard in that, certainly.
So if we can just jump to the new and young workers, just some of the numbers about it. So new and young workers are 4 times more likely to be injured, right? Again, motor vehicle traffic accidents, right? 25.6%. Accidental falls, we talked a bit about that. You know, accidents caused by machinery, you know, contact with machinery, not using it properly, bumping into it, being hit by machinery. What's really interesting in First Nations groups is on reserves, because there tends to be a higher proportion of young or youth on reserves. What we are finding, or the data is finding, that there's more injuries on reserve than average off reserve, right? And it's simply because we have a younger population, we need to make sure they know more about health and safety.
New workers, so the basics of what we'd like to see you orientating on your new worker on, and no matter what you do, their rights, and the 3 big rights, well, I will say 4, so the big one would be the right to know. So you have the right to know about any hazards that exist in your work. You have the right to participate, so you have the right to participate in health and safety. You have the right to participate in coming up with solutions to your problems, you know, taking training, being a part of the process of it all. Everyone has an equal stake and an equal voice in health and safety. The most important one, which I promote a lot, especially to young workers, old workers, is the right to refuse unsafe work. And I can tell you, as a young construction worker, 20 years ago, we were very apprehensive about ever refusing unsafe work. There was reprisal. So there is a section of the legislation they've beefed up, and it speaks to reprisal. So if you're acting in good faith, or you're asking your employer to act in good faith under the act, they can't come back. And of course, the new one would be definitely violence and harassment. No one should be subject to a violent workplace, or no one should be harassed in the workplace. The responsibilities, so on day 1, we like to, okay, you're going to be a worker on our job, you're responsible for this, this is the scope of your work. You don't need to be over there if you don't need to be over there, that type of stuff. Workplace hazards, well, that's the big one. So everybody should be shown, taken around their workplace and say, okay, this is a very hazardous area here. Be aware of this. Awareness is a big part of all this. The more aware everybody is about the hazards, the better off we'll be. How are they going to protect themselves? You know, does certain work require certain PPE, certain safe work procedures, certain instruction, that type of stuff. How to participate in health and safety, and that goes right back to your IRS and the cultural side of things. So if they're promoted on that first day of work to be a part of this whole process and not to have any fear of, you know, having a voice, that's definitely a good thing. And we're starting to see that. I can tell you in my 20 years, things have improved greatly, especially with the young workers. They're different, you know, they have different values and different morals, and they do things differently, and that's okay. And that's what the industry needs to understand. We're changing. It's a cultural shift, right? Where to go for more information? Definitely. So definitely, usually your first source of information should be your supervisor. We always say that your first person you should go speak to is your supervisor. And that's why these workplace parties, such as that health and safety rep, the committees, are we use those to kind of monitor that IRS to keep that flowing. What do you do in case of emergency? We have to prepare for every sort of emergency, you know, fire, and depending on the scope of your work. If there's certain hazards or certain dangers in your work, we should know what to do when something does ultimately happen.
I was attending a presentation by a Ministry of Labor inspector up around the Kenora area, and someone was building a cottage on a lake, so it was pretty removed from the main road and everything else, and there were two guys working on it, one young guy and then his supervisor. Supervisor had to go in and get some more supplies, so he said, hey, to the young guy, you just keep doing this, just put those boards up and, use this saw. But what they didn't think about was in case of emergency. So what happened is this guy's using a skill saw and actually cut his finger. So he's starting to bleed quite heavily. So he pulls out his cell phone. There's no cell service there. So what does the guy do? So now he's there, he's injured, he can't call for help, there was no planning there for first aid, like what could this kid do? So he actually walked in the snow quite a long ways before someone came by and he flagged them down and was able to get some assistance. So when we talk about, on reserves, we have some pretty isolated areas. So when you're thinking about having new workers there and having them work alone, you need to think about first aid. How do they access first aid or emergency services? One of the other things we found with new workers is, we do all of this training. In fact, the Ministry of Labor has, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, mandatory health and safety awareness training for workers and supervisors. And it's really aimed toward youth because they weren't getting the basic health and safety information. And essentially it's that information there about their rights and things like that. But one of the key things that the Health and Safety Associations has found is that we need to talk to young workers about how do you ask your questions? Like, what if the supervisor's your dad? What if the supervisor's your uncle? How do you ask that question, right? Because sometimes when you're a young person, you kind of get a little intimidated by your supervisor, or you don't know how to ask it properly. And sometimes, believe it or not, youth can kind of be, what's the right word? Like, hey man, tell me this. They don't ask in the way that's going to work, right? So sometimes we also need to train them, how do you ask that question? What information do you need? It becomes important besides the knowing your rights stuff.
And make sure they understand the orientation and they're participating, because you'll see a lot of young people. I remember I was that young guy, and you're very scared and nervous, and they're sitting at the table going like this the whole time, shaking. And what do they understand? Very little.
Nothing.
So make sure, I always say to supervisors, if you're going to assign somebody work, say, what did I just ask you to do? Explain that to me, or how are you going to do that? And then where we see a big gap is in the follow-up of this stuff. So now I've assigned a worker a task. Make sure you go follow up, 15, 20 minutes from now. Make sure the worker is doing that task safely. They do understand your instructions, that kind of thing. We see that very common in my industry. So a lot of employers now we'll see are actually putting together a little knowledge verification, like a 3 or 4 question test at the end of the orientation to make sure that the worker does understand. Nothing complicated, just a simple document, which is also another great piece of due diligence for you guys as employers.
So we wanted to show you a quick video about new and young workers, and I don't know if I can start it from here or if we need to start it from there.
Nope. You'll have to do it from the computer.
Yeah.
We have all sorts of great resources. The IHSA website's a great resource. Check it out. There's a lot of policy and program documents, safe work procedures. They're all Word documents, so you can add into them, change them. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of great stuff out there. So if you ever want some help with that, you can always call me, and I'll give you a hand with that, no problem. The website's free. Here we go. Well, the way the Safe Work Associations work is through WSIB premiums. So to answer your question, the way the Safe Work Associations work is through WSIB premiums. So depending on which rate group you pay into, you're treated as a member or non-member. There's different prices for members and non-members. Yeah. The device is free. Yeah. Yeah, I believe they're going to standardize the certification training for health and safety reps, stuff like that. Hopefully we start to see all the training standardized down the road. So he mentioned there's going to be a standard for working at heights coming out April 1st. So it's all laid out, it's all legislated. If you work at a height, you know, you're going to have to sit through a 6.5-hour program. There's a hands-on component.
Get a certification from that?
Sorry?
If you go to the safety rep course, you're going to get a certification for that?
Yeah, you'll get a card, and basically you'll be able to be a worker rep or a management rep on a committee.
So I can go down to the other First Station and train those guys once I get that certification?
Not so much. No, you know, it's actually
What does that certify me to do then?
certifies you to be a health and safety rep on a project in a workplace. It's about the knowledge and the training.
Does that make him the competent person?
I would say yes, it probably would make him a competent person or a competent worker, depending on your role. So you might be a worker rep, you might be a management rep.
Fall protection regulations are different in Manitoba than they are in Ontario.
Yeah, province to province, we're all a little bit different, certainly. I think all the provinces are certainly on the rise. British Columbia, very good for long-time health and safety. I think we'd be about second with Alberta. Starts to go after that, so. Yeah, there's different, important to understand the legislation, where you fall in, right? Every province has their own sector-specific regulations and the act. Our act and regs is for Ontario.
So a lot of employers I work for, they don't explain a lot of safety things, like as a worker, you have the right to refuse if your life's in danger.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I actually took employer to court, well, not court, but labor board, and
Yep.
that employer had to pay me, because he sent me home, I didn't want to do work. So he had to pay me those 2 weeks because
And good on you as a worker for refusing to do the work. And you know, sadly, you've actually done the employer a favor, right?
We've actually had summer students refusing to do work because a lot of them are intimidated by the lawnmower. Like, you know, lawnmower. There's a lot of kids who never touch a lawnmower in their lives.
Right.
They felt
Yeah.
intimidated.
So part of your training then would be around that lawnmower, is
Yeah.
training them how to
Lawnmower
operate,
orientation.
right? More orientation. But you're right, you know, in terms of, you know, if it's dangerous work, there are provisions under the Ontario legislation as well as a federal legislation that says, you know, I can refuse work if it's unsafe. You know, and there's a process they have to go through to deal with those types of issues so that things don't happen like you're being sent home, right? Or those types of
I
things.
got to say, you did the right thing in that circumstance. You didn't put your life on the line. This is only work, so it is not worth dying for, risking your life for. Is it hard? Certainly. It's hard to go and to lose work, and it's a tough spot to be in, but good on you for going the right way. And like I said, you've done the employer a favor, because, you know, if you went out and did that work and you got killed, or, you know, who's going to pay?
the next 2 weeks, we're in safety seminars after that.
Yep. Due diligence, that's right. And it's all about assessing your needs. You know, if it's as simple as a lawnmower, or you could be building a home, or so you got to kind of gather that information beforehand to put that all into your orientation right off the go. Now they like to see stuff, what happens to you if you're going to get hurt, do you have a return to work program, all this stuff. It should be laid out day one, as far as I'm concerned.
So we had 2 great videos for you guys to see, but technology is not working with us today, so we're gonna have to skip the videos. Unfortunately, we'll try to maybe pull one up later if we can, but we don't want to.
And hopefully they'll be posted on the
Yeah.
website. And hello to all the people in the communities watching. That's pretty cool. I've never been on camera before, so that's interesting. Thanks for being with us.
Yes. And you no longer have to look at a blank screen. We're gonna move ahead. So in terms of orientation, there's different levels of orientation. We talk about, sort of level 1 is just that general training, general orientation. So that includes things like department functions. What does this department do? What does this group do? What's the reporting relationship, If you've got a problem, do you run to the CEO? Do you run to chief and counsel? No, you run to your supervisor. But sometimes we need to be very clear about that so people know, right? And you need to talk about the health and safety policy. What is the health and safety policy of the organization? You want to make sure people know that. Who's the health and safety rep? Whether it's for that construction project, whether it's for the band, who is that health and safety rep? Or if you have a workplace health and safety committee, who's on that committee, right? Workers need to know about that as well. And then there's those standard operating procedures. So Andre, you'd mentioned the lawnmower. So what's the standard operating procedure around the lawnmower, right? The SOP will tell you specifically, here are all the steps involved in operating this piece of equipment. Another really important one is, how do you report hazards? So let's say that lawnmower is faulty. What do you do? How do you report it? Who do you report it to? Is it just by talking to someone and say, hey, Andre, the lawnmower is broken? Or do I actually have to write something? Right? So if you've got a good health and safety program, that process is in place and people need to know about it. And the other thing is, how do you report injuries or illnesses? My dad used to work out in the bush camps, and they never reported injuries or illnesses. He would just come home with these big Band-Aids on his legs because he'd cut his leg with a chainsaw, right? There was no reporting. In our world today, we know there's mandatory reporting under WSIB. There's mandatory reporting from an employer perspective. But again, how do you do that? Who do I tell? Do I tell my supervisor? Do I have to tell HR? Do I have to tell the band? Who do I tell? We need to be very clear with that. So this is kind of level 1 of orientation, giving kind of the whole organizational picture of what's required. And the other thing is, what about return to work? So I do get injured. How do I get back to work? Is there some mechanism where I might be able to do some modified work? Do I have to get a doctor's note? All of those things, people need to know about them. And they're great things to cover right at orientation, because again, you're setting the stage. Tyler?
Nope. Yeah. Wonderful.
So this is level 1 orientation, but here is sometimes they're both critical. Here's the one that becomes really important, I think, from the individual perspective.
Yeah, especially as an employee. Back again, like I said, to your role. What's my role in the workplace? What am I responsible for? I think often people think they're responsible for a lot more than they are, but sometimes the duty may lay on somebody else. The supervisor's role and responsibility. So a big duty of an employer is to provide us with competent supervision. So somebody who has that knowledge, training, experience and understands the health and safety aspect of their work. Health and safety hazards specific to the job, and that's the big one in my world now. Kind of, we call them job hazard analysis, field level risk assessments, tailgate meetings, tailboard meetings. It's we do it right there on site now. Very rarely in construction did somebody hand you a procedure or a program. So now we basically look at our task, we break that task down into steps. We identify all the hazards that come along with each step, and we identify controls that we're going to put in place to protect ourselves. That's kind of become the new way of protecting ourselves, and those 5-minute conversations in the morning, because I'm not sure what you know or what Grace knows. You may have expertise on something, you may have had experience in this, so we've found that those JHAs or assessments, and they don't take a lot of time. Once the employer has trained the supervisor and the workers on how to do it, it becomes like tying your boots in the morning. And I know a lot of backlash in construction, people weren't real keen on writing things down and stuff. But again, like I said, once you're trained on how to do this, it becomes a part of your daily life, and they are effective. It's been proven to me, so I've been converted. Safe work practices, procedures, and precautions. So important to know the controls for your hazards, whether it be a lockout, tagout type thing, or tying off on the roof, or understanding about your lawnmower, that kind of stuff. And we get that through our knowledge and our experience and asking people. Use, care, and maintenance of PPE. So when I started, sometimes it was hard to get basic PPE. It was hard to get a pair of gloves. Or how many times you see some guys working with no hard hats on and no safety boots, stuff like that. So very important. Do you have to train your worker on how to use earplugs? Yeah, you do. You have to train them on how to do everything. So And I would document all that for your due diligence and then get the workers to sign off saying they understand how to use all this stuff. Location of first aid facilities, fire equipment, all that stuff. And you should understand your environment that you're working in and where all this stuff is located and what to do if something does happen. The better we plan stuff, the better chance, things won't get worse after something has happened. An emergency plan, well, construction's real tough. We have to theoretically plan for every emergency out there. So again, back to that orientation. What do I do? Where do I go? Who do I speak to?
So think of it on the construction side of it, we often think of construction because it's high hazard, right? But when you think about housing, there's other things that come into play as well. Like who does maintenance, right? Who does the cleaning, around some of the housing kinds of things? Who does the yard maintenance? Who does that kind of stuff? Those people also need to have job-specific training. They also need to be oriented as well. When we were talking about personal protective equipment, it's not saying, here's your hard hat or here are your safety boots, but it's also teaching them actually how to put the hard hat on. And I know it sounds silly,
Yep.
but you see a lot of people walking around sometimes and the hard hat is just kind of bobbling on their head. It's not on properly, right? And, the new safety glasses that are out right now are actually pretty slick, pretty nice looking, and they look really nice perched on your hard hat. But that's not where we want them to be, right? So, it's really giving people that training, saying, you do need to wear your safety glasses. They're nice. And you can wear them when you're not working because they're kind of cool looking, but when you're working, you need to be wearing them and how to wear them properly, right? We talk about some of the more seasoned workers, and some people might wear bifocal lenses. So safety glasses might become a little different right then. So often you'll see they wear them down here so they can kind of see over them, but they're not protecting their eyes necessarily then. So again, it's also how do you put on that equipment?
Manufacturer's instructions are a great resource. Yeah. I see all the men laughing because when do men read the manufacturer's instructions? Usually when it's broken or it doesn't look like the picture kind of a thing, right? So and that's a great training tool, right? You sit down with your worker with their lawnmower and say, okay, here's the operating manual for the lawnmower. Here's all the safety precautions. And there's your written component of your training. So simple stuff like that is very effective. I guess the other thing I was going to mention is a lot of this stuff's hard, I imagine, for a lot of people because I look around, I know a lot of you guys wear a lot of different hats. I was talking to people in the community. I don't think there's one person in this room that only has one function. You guys all do a lot of different types of work and different jobs, so you have different roles from your day-to-day. So tough to understand all that, and it's a challenge, certainly.
So when we talk about orientation training, one size does not fit all, clearly by our illustration here. So when we talk about one size does not fit all, so can you have just kind of one orientation program and it's on paper and it's here you go? Where do we have problems with some of our orientation programs? Anyone? Let me toss out an idea. What if somebody can't read? What do you do then? What does your orientation look like then? So Tyler, do you want to tell them your story?
Yeah, it happens to me quite often, being in construction. What's that, Andre? Well, I don't know. Just because someone has a disability or disadvantage, I don't think they deserve any less training or, yeah.
That's right.
Being in construction, I've often come across people with literacy issues, and truthfully, sometimes they're the most competent workers out there. So you have to do things in a different way. So maybe you have to communicate things orally or through demonstration or through pictures or videos and that's another thing in your I would want my workers to come to me with this type of stuff, and there should be that. I understand freedom of information and all that stuff, but if you create a good open dialogue in your workplace, people will come to you with these types of issues, and we can work around them all, no doubt in my mind.
Tyler was telling me just the other day he was doing some working from heights training.
Yes.
And two of the guys came up to him and said, you know what, I really struggle with reading. And you have to write a test, right? And it's a written test.
Yeah, and we ended up at the end, certainly we don't prompt people along, but we administered in an oral way and make them feel comfortable and sit down and, make considerations for people. Like I said, just because you have you're different than somebody else doesn't mean you don't deserve the same level of training or the same level of health and safety in your world.
So we talked about literacy being one of the big things. The other thing that comes into play is learning styles, right? We all have different learning styles. I'm a great auditory learner. If you talk to me, I can take it in. If you make me read it, I'll take it in, but it's going to take me forever, right? I'm much better if you talk my way through it. There are other people who like to, they want everything to be hands-on, right? And that's how they learn best. So when we're putting together our orientation programs, we need to find out what's going to work best for someone. If you're giving some instructions and you're talking to them and they're kind of looking clued out and it's not going in, you might want to ask them, say, you know what, hey, if I demonstrate this, is this going to help you more? Or ideally, when you're doing your training, you do oral, so you talk about it, you do a visual component and a hands-on component. That way you're covering most of the learning styles. So it really does make a big difference in the orientation program. And again, one size does not fit all.
Absolutely. And there it is, right? Some people are really good at, like Margaret said, she's good at the auditory side of things, so you can tell her something and she understands things very quickly. Me, I'm more of a show-me guy, being a construction guy. I like the hands-on. I could probably read it in the manual 10 times, but you could take me out 1 time, 2 times, and I kind of learned more in that type of environment. Letting people do it, and that was a tough one in the trades. You got into the trades, and you were waiting sometimes years for an opportunity to get a chance to do that type of work. So we did a lot of watching. So we did a lot of observing tradesmen and journeyman people, and you really have to let people know you want to learn how to do something and you're interested in it, and keep pushing, and you'll get that opportunity sooner or later.
Really, the best practice methodology is when you do all of those.
Absolutely.
So, you know, the worker is saying, tell me what you want me to do. So you're teaching them about the theory behind what you're doing and why it's important. Really, the show me part is you're actually doing a demonstration for them so they can see someone else doing it. The let me do it means, as a supervisor, what you're doing is you're watching then, how are they doing it? Are they doing it properly? Can you give them some, feedback as they're doing it? And then with that watch me part, that's when you've already done your training and now they're actually doing the job. You want to monitor and make sure they're doing it, right? Sometimes we learn things and then when we actually go over and start doing the job, sometimes we take some shortcuts, right?
Absolutely.
You want to watch for those shortcuts. And really sorry, Tyler.
No.
I'm kind of taking over here. When we
Fabulous.
talk about top training techniques, this is what we found. Most people practice or learn best by actually doing. So that has to be a central part of your training program. Standing up here and just lecturing at you, kind of only hits that 5% mark, right? So we'll do some demonstration later just to make sure everyone gets it. But anyhow, that's just a sense of what training best practice looks like. So your orientation program would include all of those elements.
Whatever works is the best thing for you, right?
So a couple of tips for supervisors. Schedule enough time for orientation, right? It isn't a 5-minute discussion. If we're doing orientation, health and safety orientation properly, it takes more than 5 minutes. So it isn't, first day you start the new job is, hey, I only got 5 minutes to give you an orientation. Wrong approach. You need to schedule time in for orientation, and it becomes really important. You need to spend a lot of time explaining the job. Doing the training and actually supervising, particularly around new and young workers or those vulnerable workers we talked about. And here's a really important one. Explain all those hazards and all the safety things before they actually start doing the job, right? When it comes to health and safety, you don't want to actually learn about the hazards when you're actually doing the job. You want to know about them before, right? Because then you can control them and protect yourself from them. And it's not simply just being the supervisor who's there for that 5 minutes of training and then you never see your supervisor again. As supervisors, you really want to be visible. You want to be there so they can ask you questions, you can answer questions, and you've kind of got that ongoing dialogue again. It goes to that teamwork and that whole culture piece of it. And here's the other thing, lead by example, right? There's no sense telling someone they have to wear a hard hat all the time when the supervisor doesn't wear their hard hat. Right? So leading by example. It happens lots, right? The other thing is, it works really well if you pair up a young worker with sometimes a more experienced or seasoned worker who's going to give them some of that time to teach them how to do things and reinforce some of the things. And we also talked about recognizing and reinforcing safe work practices. In the health and safety world and in some other things, we also talk about, oh my God, Tyler broke the rules, progressive discipline for him, right? We all know it's going to be a verbal warning, a written warning, blah, blah, blah. What we don't do very well in the health and safety world is we don't do a lot of positive reinforcement. So when you see someone who's working really, really well and working really safely, you want to compliment them on that. You want to acknowledge it. Because I can tell you, the more you reinforce good, safe working habits, the more likely it is that individual is going to keep up with those good work and safe habits, rather than taking the shortcuts and things like that. And really, it takes like 1 second. Well, hey, Tyler, great job, thanks. I love it when you wear all your PPE. Good job.
Yeah,
Took
it
me
goes a
less than
long
a
way.
minute.
Yeah, just a good job goes a long way, especially in construction. Not that any of us were ever waiting for a pat on the back, but the supervisor styles have changed out there. Used to be that more authoritative type of world. Now everything's become very participative. The best supervisors are asking, what do you guys think? Does anyone know a better way? Getting everybody's input, getting everyone involved has become a very effective way of supervising.
And one of the most important things you need to do as a supervisor is document. Document, document, document. It doesn't have to be a big form letter or a big thesis or anything. It's carrying around a little notebook saying, you know what? Tyler did a fabulous job today and I'm going to write it down. Or, I gave Tyler some extra instruction on operating that lawnmower and just write it down. That's your due diligence, right? So it's just a quick sentence, date, time, that's it.
I get scared by documentation sometimes, but I always tell people just write things very simply, plainly, in your own words. None of us are, there's no spelling doesn't count, grammar doesn't count. Just be able to recall what you wrote and understand how you write things is perfect. But yeah, if it's not on paper, it certainly doesn't exist. And when an incident happens, that may be your only defense. When you get charged under the Act, you are guilty. So you have to prove your innocence. It's the opposite, right? So if you don't have that logbook or those training records or proof of your action and stuff like that, sorry? Oh, absolutely. You could be civilly sued. Who knows, depending on what's going on. So you walk into court with just your word. You're walking in there with nothing. So you'll be paying or worse.
So as a supervisor, if you kind of do these things and you do good health and safety orientations, you're protecting the organization. Again, you're protecting the community, but you're also protecting yourself as a supervisor because you've got liability, as Tyler was just telling us, and you're demonstrating all your due diligence, which is really critical.
Your orientation program itself, so you should be expressing your company's policy and program to your workers. So the policy is usually the old one-page statement on the front door. Here at ABC, we're committed to this, our supervisors do this, our workers do this, and then the program is usually a big binder that sits somewhere with everything used to implement your policy to back up what you said you're going to do. And communication is certainly the key to all of this, and we have become better communicators, I think, in workplaces, and keeping those lines of communication open and making people feel like they can have that voice is critical. Training programs, so if you have to instill a formal training program, or you have to get training throughout your job, if the work changes, the scope of your work changes, new tasks come up, keep records of all that. They should have a card or a record of training, each worker. Usually an inspector comes up and they see you working at a height, they're going to say, let me see your working at heights card or your fall protection card. And then they're probably going to start to ask you a few of those competence-based questions, right? Document, and then evaluate the program. So, if something doesn't work, fix it. Ask your workers, was our orientation effective? Is there something that you think we could do better? Is there something we could change? They're the ones getting the orientation, so getting some feedback from them is a good way of keeping your program relevant and alive and well and thriving.
And if you have, a health and safety orientation around lawnmowers, thanks for bringing up that example, by the way, and then you realize, I did all my orientation, I taught them the standard operating procedures for the lawnmower, But man, we got 3 injuries regarding lawnmowers. That's certainly a signal you need to
Yeah.
go back and evaluate your program again. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
pretty straightforward. But sometimes we don't find out about the injuries, right? It goes to HR or it goes to the WSIB and we forget about them. But it's a clear marker as to what's going on in your workplace.
Yeah, so having a good program where workers are reporting hazards and injuries and incidents is great. You actually get a true reflection of what's truly happening in your workplace.
So we've kind of tossed a lot of stuff at you today, but we also wanted to tell you there's a lot of resources available. So here's a sample checklist for an orientation program. It talks about, the general orientation as well as the job-specific orientation. So we did bring some handouts that are available here at the front, but we're also going to be directing you to our website where these are free downloads, right? Just take them, make them your own, make it fit your organization and use them, right? You don't have to start from zero. There's lots of resources around. So this is just a sample checklist.
And this would be a sample JSA, or JF risk assessment, basically. So again, identifying this is my task, breaking that down into steps. These are the hazards, and here's how we're going to control them. So once you've trained and orientated workers on something like this, it becomes a very effective way of keeping workers safe and keeping people aware of hazards and stuff like that.
There's some employers that work where they have a test after the orientation, and there's some that don't.
Yeah,
And some of the work I did, there's some hotshots that come in and say, oh, I don't need orientation.
yep.
But when they do the test, they're the ones that fail it.
Yeah, that's very common. See that all the time.
And they're the ones that usually cause the accidents when they don't have the test too, right?
There you go. There's the proof, right?
That test part can become really valuable. I mean, it doesn't have to be this big,
No.
humongous 40-question test. It's just a couple of key questions, right? It's almost asking the person to parrot back to you what you've taught them or show it to you. But the test just makes it a little bit more efficient, and it's definitely worthwhile. One of the videos we had was actually going to talk to that a little bit, but yet that's a good thing to put into your orientation program. Absolutely. So in terms of resources, again, you're not alone. You have the health and safety partners. There's IHSA, WSPS. There's 2 other health and safety associations that are also available as a resource to you. So infrastructure, health and safety, that's the website, ihsa.ca. And that's Tyler. And that's how you can get a hold of Tyler by email. Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, our website, WSPS.ca, and that's how you can get a hold of me. But go to our websites. There's tons of stuff there.
Fabulous.
Free downloads. There's actually the construction, IHSA has actually a construction health and safety manual. If you go to our website, we'll talk about, here's how you set up your health and safety program, right? All the steps you need to go through. So please use them. A lot of our services are free. When we do different types of training, there are times where we have to charge for training, but, use the resources. We're also here for guidance and advice, and there's no charge for guidance and advice.
And if we don't know, we'll point you in the right direction, because there's a lot of wonderful health and safety people in Thunder Bay and in our region, in our area. And, we really promote, we have a real grassroots kind of model up here in the north. So, yeah, we'll help you get that information.
And we travel,
Yeah.
right? We go around.
Yeah, we'd love to come visit you. We'd love to come visit you.
Cool.
Any questions? You know what? Me and Margaret will hang around if you guys have any questions or you want to get a little guided website tour. We have our business cards here as well. Certainly like to thank everybody who's a part of this conference. This is my third year. Thanks, Grace, for having us. You can see it growing and getting better and better, and nice to see really a proactive bunch of people all get together and do something for the greater. So thank you to all the volunteers and the staff and the committees and their technical guys and the Valhalla and most importantly you guys, the delegates, the people who come a long way from your community to come and hang out with us all and share our information. So.
Thank you. You know what, use your evaluation forms. We wanted to introduce health and safety. I think it's so important in the community. But if there's something specific you'd like, maybe Tyler or Margaret to present
Absolutely.
Write that down, give us some suggestions, what more you'd like to see in this topic area. Because we would like to bring them back again.
Yeah,
Sure.
we'd love to be here. We will be back.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you,
And
Grace.
at
Thank you.
first It was great, I thought it
Appreciate
was
it.
very informative, and I hope you did as